The first presenter today is Clarissa Cagnato. Clarissa is a postdoctoral fellow on the ANR-funded research project Starch for Sapiens at Aix-Marseille Université. She received her master's from Yale University and her PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. Her dissertation focused on the cuisine and the use of ritual plants by ancient Maya people that inhabited northwestern Petén during the Classic period. Clarissa's main interests include reconstructing ancient diets through the study of both macrobotanical remains and starch grains, and she's especially interested in identifying plants that tend to be overlooked in the archaeological record. Clarissa collaborates actively with archaeological projects in Guatemala and Mexico, and has also worked in other regions and time periods, from early Neolithic diet of populations living in the Paris Basin in France to documenting the last meal of sacrificed chimu camelids in Peru. Clarissa's talk today is titled From the Visible to the Invisible, Ancient Maya and Teotihuacan Foodways as understood by the study of macro and microbotanical remains. Please welcome Clarissa Cagnato.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Harry, and thank you, Matt and Max, for organizing and inviting me to this wonderful event. So I'm going to share the screen with you. All right. Can you see it? Okay.
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So yes, my talk is from the visible to the invisible. The visible, I refer to the macrobotanical remains, which are the ones that are visible to the naked eye. So the seeds. And then the invisible, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more, the starch grains and beyond. So I do want to note that my talk is going to focus specifically on the Classic period, even though I've had the opportunity to work on the pre-Classic as well. But today we'll be focusing on the Classic period, and I'll presenting, I do want to start with some of the amazing research that has been done by my colleagues. So some of the recent discoveries, mainly focused on paleobotanical studies. And then I will talk a little bit more about foodways, both in the Maya region at Teotihuacan, based on my research. And I do want to end with what I call the microcosmos, which is basically some of the other things which I can see on the slides, which can maybe tell us a little bit more about foodways, and it's something that I'm developing right now. So let's go. So foodways, how do we get to it? We're very lucky that, especially for the Maya, we really have a plethora of evidence. We can look at the beautiful ceramics, murals. We can also look at, obviously, the zooarchaeological remains, so the animals. Here we have a lovely peccary, still intact. Then we can also look at the glyphs, the writing, which gives us some clues into what were the ingredients that were used. We can look at the current Maya populations, and that can inform us a lot on the foodways. And then, of course, we have the plant remains, which you can see here, chili peppers, notably. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's two types of botanical categories, really. The macrobotanicals, which you can see with the naked eye, and which will be recovered mostly through flotation. And when I say visible to the naked eye, you can see them, but obviously recognizing them, you will still require microscopes to identify things. And then we have a separate category, which is the microbotanical remains. And this will include starch, phytoliths, and even pollen grains. And these will be recovered in, for example, cores, but also from, for example, artifacts like ceramics, manos and metates, and even dental calculus. And you can also get it from feces if you're lucky enough to get them. So really, by combining these two approaches, we really get to a much more nuanced reconstruction of past foodways. So what are some of the exciting things that have been done recently? Well, okay, 1990 was a while ago, I realize now, but it really set in motion some really interesting studies that were based on residue analysis. So looking at the organic substances that are found within a specific artifact, so ceramics. So for example, the cacao residues from the Rio Azul vessel is obviously famous now. And it was even more cool because there's a cacao glyph on the outside. And since then, there's been a number of other studies that have focused on residues. And for example, chili peppers residues found in 2013 from Chiapas. And then in 2014, the discovery of agave residues inside ceramics from Teotihuacan. So potentially the consumption of pulque, which is really quite difficult to actually find. So this was pretty notable. And then in terms of the actual microbotanical remains, so phytolith starch, 2013, I thought it was really cool, these fired clay bowls that were found by Stephanie Sims and colleagues. And by looking inside, they were able to find phytoliths and starch grains. And they're pretty unique, actually. I don't think there's anything similar that has been found so far. In 2014, starch grains from archaic period settlements by Robert Rosenzweig and colleagues, where chili peppers and manioc was found on a variety of tools. And then I put my own research with my colleague Jocelyn Ponce, where we found starch grains from a range of artifacts from La Corona, and I will come back to that. And then on a different scale, there's been some really amazing work done, obviously, with the recovery of the murals from Calakmul, where we beautifully preserved and where we get a sense of what ingredients were sold and, of course, the existence of markets. So very exciting work. In 2011, the recovery of manioc, not necessarily directly manioc, but they were plaster casts, so the stuff that you use, so dentists use. And by filling in the gaps, they were able to find these manioc casts that you can see here and really indicating that manioc was sort of a widespread crop and not just a secondary one. Even more recently, 2020, so last year, isotopic evidence for quite early maize consumption in the Americas. And that was done by Kenneth and colleagues. And then this year, this just came out by David Lentz and his colleagues on environmental DNA. So there's really some really cool stuff coming out from the reservoirs around Tikal or in Tikal, indicating that what vegetation was actually growing at different time periods. So this is some of the very, very cool things that I think have come out recently. And can all help us get to ancient foodways. So, I'm sorry. So let's go into feasting and daily fare at La Corona during the late to terminal classic. This was work that I did during my dissertation, and while I was at Washington University in St. Louis. So you probably hopefully know about La Corona, located in northwestern Petén. It's been really excavated for a long time now by Marcelo Canuto and Tomas Barrientos. And there's been really some really cool discoveries coming out of there. Of course, I've been focusing more on the plant remains that have been discovered from various parts of the site. And one particular context is this chultun, so an underground pit that is human-made, and this contained the remains of a very large feast. So I was able to look at the plant remains. The ceramics have been studied or are studied by Caroline Paris from Tulane, and Diana Friedberg looked at the animal bones. We're talking about extremely dense midden with thousands of ceramics. I think Carrie can probably tell you more about that. I knew about 6,000 sherds the last time, so that's a lot already, and more than 1,200 faunal remains. And in total, we're talking about over 300 plant remains that were identified. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that because it can tell us more about the feasting that actually took place at La Corona during the 8th century AD. So one of the things that came out was, of course, maize. This was probably one of the most common and frequently found plant remains, which is not really surprising, but it was really, it was pretty well preserved. So that was exciting, of course. And then different seeds belonging to the tomato family, so Solanaceae. And so, for example, we can imagine tomatillos, which are consumed today, which you can see here, and then maybe some other species. It's really pretty tricky to differentiate between these species under the microscope because they're very, very similar, but definitely tomato family. I was very excited as well to find different kinds of bean family, which again are still consumed today. And then we have things that are called quelites, for example, notably in Mexico. So weedy green plants, weedy plants that grow in disturbed spaces. For example, goosefoot, chenopodium, and amaranth. These are very, very small seeds, but they were found in, they were quite numerous, and they're still consumed today, especially amaranth in Mexico. They're used to make alegrías, for example, and goosefoot, chenopodium is mostly known. Some of you might consume it as quinoa. It's a different species, but well, it's basically quinoa. Then there were other plants like portulaca or purslane, which is, it's not really well known today, but all the plant is edible, and it's this one here. And it produces, again, very small seeds. In terms of fruit, nanse, which you can buy today commonly in the marketplaces, and it can be eaten fresh, but you can also cook it. And then what was even more exciting for me, because I never found such well-preserved flowers, is basically flowers. There were, these are all carbonized, of course, and perhaps, I mean, yeah, you have to look at them under the microscope probably to see it better, but these are basically flower buds. And so we know that the Maya consumed different flowers. Were these specific flowers in the chultun, or part of the feasting, part of the feast, because they were consumed, or were they perhaps just ceremonial? They were decorative. Well, that is a little bit harder to actually answer. But if we look at the this is from a ceramic vessel, and you can see here a scene of a palace with a probable ruler, and his attendants have flowers in their hands. So we know that flowers were important for the Maya, and here we have some beautiful decorations made from greenstone that were probably used to decorate headbands or headdresses. And again, they're flowers, and flowers are really everywhere. So I'm not really surprised that we would find them in a feasting context, but I cannot say for sure if they were actually consumed or not, or both. Then another category of plants, which I thought was interesting, was the recovery of things like the Mexican prickly poppy, which you can see here, and then cockleburr. So these, it was the first time that these plants had been recovered in the archaeobotanical record. And so it makes it a little bit harder to actually compare with other contexts, especially feasting contexts, when you don't have anything similar. However, when you look at the properties of these plants, you realize that they are emetics or purgatives. So they will make you expel either from one end or another. I know this is before lunch for some of you, so my apologies, but it's basically that. So we have enema scenes on vessels like this one, for example. We don't actually know the exact substances, and who knows, maybe some of these were actually used for, because of this. I cannot say one way or another, like definitely, but given their properties, why not? And then we also have evidence of perhaps vomiting, expelling. I mean, we all know sort of about the Romans, how they used to eat a lot, right? And then vomit and eat again. So I don't know, but it could have been something something similar as well, or to purge and then start again. So why not? So it would have been an interesting feast, I can imagine. So I mentioned some of the ingredients that were consumed, and so we have the ingredients, but how were they put together? That is something that I wish we obviously had more information about. When we look at the paintings on the ceramics, we have some potential evidence. For example, this the ceramic dish that perhaps has these little bowls, which potentially could be bowls of maize, so tamales perhaps, with some kind of sauce on them. Why not, right? We do have all the ingredients in the from the feasting deposit. For example, the maize to produce the tamales. We have the tomatillos to produce for the sauce. We also have the greens, the quelites, that could have been incorporated, such as like they are today, as well as the beans. And then, of course, all the parts that I didn't discuss, which is all the meaty parts, right? All the faunal remains. So perhaps these tamales, it would have been like tamales, which have been stuffed with different meats. And today, if you go to Guatemala, to Mexico, there are such a variety of wonderful dishes. Of course, some of these have elements that are introduced after after the arrival of the Spanish. But if you consider some of these dishes, there are they could have been such a variety of preparations, and especially of colors. I really think that is very, very appealing when you look at this: the greens, the reds, the yellows, and then maybe with the addition of the flowers. I think it would have been really, really cool place to be. I'm sorry, go back. So a little bit later, so the structure or the context that I was talking to you about was a late classic, and now we're going into the terminal classic, always at La Corona. And the chultun that I mentioned is up here, right, just north of or just above the primary deposit, which was a large midden. But all of this structure was reoccupied sometime in the terminal classic. And this is something that Jocelyn Ponce really studied in depth, and she excavated this whole structure. And so she collected flotation, so sediment samples from into flotation from these various rooms, which you can see with the red stars. And then these other, the manos and metates, which were all fragmented, unfortunately, as well as some ceramics from the primary deposit, were studied for starch analysis. So we really wanted to see what were the people that were eating during this this later phase, really just before it was abandoned. What were they consuming? The ceramics, I should mention, were few, because unfortunately most of them were washed by the time I got my hands on them. However, we were able to get sherds from jars, such as these ones, that would have typically contained water or liquids, of course. So the idea was to see what were these jars containing, besides maybe just water. I do want to mention that in the primary, in the midden that I mentioned, I did get some, I'm sorry, not the primary deposit, in the rooms from where the stars were, the flotation samples revealed only about 30 plant remains. And so thankfully, the starch analysis really contributed to gaining a much wider perspective. And this is just a brief overview of what was found, but as you can see, it's not a lot. So it was very useful to include the starch. And what did the starch tell us? Well, maize was ubiquitous, the ceramics, and the manos and metates. Chili peppers, which I had not recovered in macrobotanical form, so in seeds. So this was very, very exciting. It was basically everywhere. And people that know me know that I cannot eat a spicy food. So I really find this to be pretty ironic, because it is literally on every single tool that I've ever worked on in the Maya region and in Mexico. So yeah, I don't know what it is, but chili peppers like me for some reason. Or at least the Maya like the chili peppers, of course. And then I was very excited about the manioc. It is really hard to document tubers or root crops in the archaeobotanical record, just because of the way that they're prepared. So it's very, very hard to find it, and finding it on almost all the tools that we recovered from this structure really indicates, I think, the importance of manioc during the Terminal Classic. But so, studies that have been done since then really show that, well, root crops are important, not just in this time period. Other root crops that I was able to document is jicama, and some people might know it. It's good just to eat it raw, right? Some people add chili pepper on it, not me. So the jicama, as well as sweet potatoes. This was also found in smaller quantities. And then canna produces beautiful flowers like this one. Its tubers are edible, and it's not something that is very well known today, but again, it's something that is totally edible. And then beyond just La Corona, I really want to stress the importance of root crops. As I mentioned just now, is that we're finding root crops really across the board from different time periods, from different parts of Mesoamerica. And I think that obviously starch grain analysis has the potential to really sort of demonstrate that root crops were very important to the ancient Maya. And here you just have a snapshot of what I've been able to find so far, Calathea, also Maranta, known as arrowroot, and also canna again. So this is from Aguada Phoenix. So a lot of different root crops coming up. And this is just from my own work. So one of the things that I think we still don't know is sort of the nuanced, right? What is going on across the board in the various Maya regions? And fortunately, there's more and more research being done in terms of paleoethnobotanical research, which is wonderful. But I still think that because of the huge area that we're looking at and the time depth, there is just a lot of work to be done. And this is especially true even within a site. What is going on between one group and another? And that is why I'm very excited to really work in depth at La Corona with Jocelyn Ponce, who is a doctoral student at Tulane. For her doctoral research, she's really doing some in-depth work on collecting elements. And I'm not just talking about plant remains, but just to really show the differences between these groups that are both on the periphery, but also in the urban core, and using La Corona as an example. So in the near future, we'll have hundreds more of flotation samples and the analysis of manos, metates, and ceramics from different groups at La Corona to really see differences within a site from the same time period. And I think that is really important to really get a sense of what's going on in terms of foodways. So let's leave the Maya region behind and let's go to Teotihuacan in the central in central Mexico, in the highlands. This is again during the classic period. And here we're talking about 350 to 400. So this is before the entrada. For those that don't know what the entrada is, it was really a significant period in time where people from Teotihuacan came to the Maya lowlands. Was it peaceful? Was it military? Well, that's something that can be debated, but the point is that here we have Maya that are either visiting or are living at Teotihuacan during a period that predates the entrada. So this is the work done by Nawa Sugiyama, Saburo Sugiyama, and colleagues working at at Plaza of the Columns, which is situated right here in Teotihuacan. The pyramid of the moon is here, and the pyramid of the sun is here. So it's very central. And during the last couple of years, there's been some exciting research and discoveries that have come out and really pointing towards the presence of the Maya. Notably, there's been 4 deposits or contexts that are significant, and offering A1 was a deposit containing thousands of human remains dismembered with cut marks and dental modifications and cranial deformations, modifications, which really point towards the Maya being probably sacrificed at some point in this particular deposit. And there then Plaza 50, within the fill of the plaza, Again, thousands of fragmented murals, Maya in style, and these seem to be purposely destroyed at some point. We don't know really why, but they're definitely Maya in style. And then we have offering D4, where there's been hundreds of these greenstone figurines and objects and even obsidian tools, even sacrificed animals, which is something that obviously NAWA is really working on, including a spider monkey, which is not native to the highlands. So it must have been imported from the lowlands. So that's a study that is ongoing. So this is all to show you that the Maya were either they were dignitaries were visiting the site or they were living there. And the fourth context that I really want to focus on is really the ritual deposit known as offering D1, because this is really where the food is coming, like the Foodways is coming out, because it was a feasting deposit. This contained at least 10,000 sherds. It's a very dense deposit, just within a 10 square meter area. The ceramics, some of them were Maya in style again, but not only. There are some other ceramics that have not been identified to any particular style, but most are local styles. And then there's faunal remains, mostly belonging to quails and rabbits. So what do the plant remains tell us? So this was, again, very, very rich. We're talking about almost 800 plant remains, and the deposit is not completed yet. So I still have a lot of work to do, but it's very exciting. And here we're finding typical plants that are typical for, even the Maya region, but also for Teotihuacan. So we have maize, the most common remain, beans, chili peppers. Here we're finding hundreds of chili pepper seeds, unlike the Maya region, where I've only been able to really determine it through starch grain analysis, squash rind, and different parts of the cactus. So for example, nopales. Then we also have lots of salvia seeds, chia, you might know it as chia. Again, hundreds of these seeds, something that is not typical in the Maya region. And then again, tomatillo, so solanaceae, the same purslane that I mentioned earlier, and the spondias. You might know it as jocote, hog plum. And this is not something typical of the highlands. So just keep that in mind. And then in terms of maybe the more ritual plants was the recovery of one tobacco seed. I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're going through dense volumes of these remains, it is. I was very excited to find it because it's so tiny, as you can see from the measurements. And then a number of evidence that flowers, again, were present, flower parts, either the seeds of Asteraceae, so sunflower family, and then just the actual parts of the flowers that were carbonized. So again, we have flowers that are part of either of the things that are being consumed or of the actual ritual itself. The starch analysis has been done on at least 20 different vessels. And just to briefly, summarize, very typical things like beans, maize, squash, and chili peppers were found. What was significant, though, was to find on this particular vessel the evidence of manioc. Now, manioc is, again, not a local plant. It must have been imported from the lowlands. It is unclear whether it was imported from the Maya lowlands, which is a distance away, 1,000 kilometers away, or it was imported more from the coast. It is unclear, but it's definitely not a local plant. And then in the offering where I mentioned where the cranial modifications were found, there was again all these common plant remains, but we still have exogenous plants, so not local, like guava and also arrowroot potentially. So we do get a sense of these foreign plants that are more typical, I would say, of the Maya or of the lowlands coming in. So one of the things, I should probably say that based on these plant remains that are found in these particular deposits, is that we can obviously see that perhaps the Maya that were living there or that came to participate, they were probably bringing in their own ingredients, things that were part of their culinary identities. And I think that that really talks to a culinary identity, perhaps that we can really see at play in that particular time period already. So here, how do we get to actually reconstruct recipes? That is something that is very hard. We are lucky in some ways to have some mentions, but again, they're very, very few. For example, in the Dresden Codex, there are mentions of what the tamales were filled with, like iguana, fish, and deer, for example, here translated by Hull. Or we have it on ceramic vessels. For example, the primary standard sequence will say what the vessel probably contained. For example, in this case, his drinking vessel for Utah, or which has been translated by Belyaev et al. As fruity or fruit cacao. But again, these are very, very rare examples. And did they really contain this? That's another question in terms of the vessels. So one of the ways that we can go about it is looking at starch grains. I mentioned earlier that that was going to be one of my main things. And starch grains are very interesting because they can, in a way, give us a bit more information about how things were processed. Because cuisine is not just about the ingredients that you use, it's about the ways in which you prepare them. Are you cooking them? Are you boiling them? Are you roasting things? Are you making tamales? Are you making tortillas? That gets to the heart of cuisine. And so with the starch grains, what is interesting is that they are affected by processes like cooking, by heat, and by mechanical processing, in other words, grinding. And for example, I've done some work on experimentally cooking and grinding various plants. So for example, we have manioc, sweet potato, and chili peppers. These are the native plants, fresh, basically, untouched, seen under transmitted and polarized light. And then how they changed based on if they're roasted or boiled. And I've done this for different times and for different plants. And so this really gives us a bit of an insight of how the plants may have been processed. And in the archaeological record, we do find a lot of damaged grains. Sometimes you find them, just not modified, which is great. But in many cases, you find them agglomerated, broken, and this can give us some ideas. So for example, boiled versus probably, versus pounded or versus baked. So starch grains really are a really great way of going about this, and have provided new ideas in how these plants were processed to prepare the foods. I do want to end with what I call the microcosmos. In the beginning, I mentioned how there are this is basically what I'm trying to go towards now, because when I start looking at the slides, when I look at the starch slides that I prepare, I don't just see starch grains, I see an entire world. For those that don't know, Microcosmos came out in 1996, and it really changed my world. But so the documentary is based on animals, the microcosmos of insects. So you see things that you wouldn't normally see, right, from their point of view. So I'm not talking about insects, of course, now I'm talking more about plants, but I like to consider it a microcosmos because we're starting to realize that there is so much more in these slides. So for example, vanilla is one of the things that is one of the ingredients that I think we would all love to find, to understand more, right? We believe that vanilla was present and was probably used by the ancient Maya, but how do we get to it? I've never been able to really find vanilla. And as you know, for those that cook with vanilla seeds are tiny, 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 and are barely visible. When you look at them under the microscope, you can see them. They're tiny. They're 200 microns wide, so really, really small. And of course, using SEM, so the scanning electron microscope, can even help even further. And that's something that I'm working on as well, working with SEM. And hopefully, perhaps these kind of seeds can be found even in the starch grain samples. Like I said, it hasn't been done yet, but it's a possibility. So I'm excited about that. And then there's other things that we can see besides starch. For example, when you look at the pulp of the actual fruits, the actual cells, when you look, this is experimentally gathered sapote fruit. This is what you see when you look at the pulp under the microscope. And I'm not saying necessarily that this is exactly what it is, what it belongs to, but it's very similar. And so I'm exploring this a little bit more. It would be exciting to find sapote, of course, at Teotihuacan, for example. It would be also an imported fruit. We also get trichomes, which you can find on the leaves of numerous plants. And depending on their shape and size, you can maybe get to what, at least what genus or just family it is. It's tricky, but it's not impossible. And these are some of the things that I found in the archaeological record. And these are, for example, trichomes that you find on Solanum torvum, which is a kind of Solanaceae. I'm sorry. There. Other things are wood elements. So to differentiate between softwoods and hardwoods, conifers, and all the other non-conifers, so hardwoods. And you can find a lot of these elements in the slides as well. So for example, softwood at Teotihuacan, it's not really surprising. There were a lot of conifers or pine back in the day, but I'm also finding some in the lowlands. So that's also cool. And then other elements of wood that are coming up, and some of them are pretty diagnostic. So I'm going to look more into that. And then if you move beyond just just the plants that you find on Earth, let's say on above water, if you look at the stuff that is underwater, you can also find microalgae and diatoms in these slides. And it doesn't require any special preparation. It's the same preparation. And so I'm finding microalgae and also these diatoms. This can tell us more if it's freshwater, if it's marine. And I think that by maybe studying the water reserves more carefully from these different sites, perhaps we can get insights into what are the water sources potentially that were being used. And then I want to end, this is my almost final slide. Then there's the world of the fungi, which is very, very vast. And we can imagine that the Maya and the Teotihuacan and everywhere, they were eating fungus. For example, today, huitlacoche, right, is consumed. But trying to find these in the archaeological record is going to be much harder. But when you find spores, such as these, in the archaeobotanical record, it can provide some clues. And finally, faunal remains are not my thing, but even in these tiny slides, I've been able to find feather barbules, so things that you find on the feathers, and these can even be diagnostic to a certain genus. In this case, to a waterfowl, potentially a duck. This is from a ceramic at Teotihuacan. So this is what I call the microcosmos, and I am very excited to move forward with this. So to end, I do want to really emphasize that obviously by using different approaches, notably the macrobotanicals and the microbotanicals, we can really get to a much broader vision of foodways, which would not be possible if you just consider one kind of remain, I think. So definitely, I encourage everyone who is interested in doing this to really work using both. And while recipes are difficult to assess, by looking, I think, at this microcosmos might prove fruitful, because we really are getting a lot more ingredients and tips on where things are coming from to potentially prepare these different foods and beverages. And some of the things that I really want to explore a bit more are what were the culinary identities of the ancient Maya? Is there more than one? How did they change through time and across space? To do this, we need a lot more data, of course. But what I find extremely interesting is, based on my work, both at Ceibal on middle preclassic material and in the middle Usumacinta region, on projects led by Takeshi Nomata and Daniela Tiadan, is that we're finding really similar materials already. So things like chili peppers, maize, even manioc, squash, beans. And so, yeah, the early basis or the beginnings of what we consider the Maya diet really was already present at this time. So, but we obviously need a lot more work to really understand this. And finally, to study this work can obviously indicate the exchange of foods across long distances, in particular, when you look at the Maya, for example, at Teotihuacan, regardless of whether these foods were actually coming from the actual Maya lowlands, or maybe from the Gulf of Mexico, or even the Pacific Ocean. We really, from any of the lowlands, it really, I think, is indicative of wanting to potentially use foods that that they would have been associated with, that made them Maya already, and that they wanted to bring to the table, so to speak, when they were at Teotihuacan. So food is a really, I think, powerful way, as many of you know, to really show your identity. And this was already visible at that time. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you to the organizers. And I will be happy to answer questions that you might have.
Grazie mille, Clarissa. Great talk.